I rushed through the debriefing at the end of class today. There was a lot more to say about price ceilings in particular, and I just wanted to go over this rent control example. First off, the technical analysis. I presented that in class before the exercise, but I wanted to make sure everybody got that. So price ceiling, we just draw it as a law setting a price below the market clearing price. Is the simplest way to analyze one. They're more complicated when you set a limit on how much a price can rise. I can show you that, but I'll make that optional. I wouldn't give you such a problem to diagnose on a test or to analyze on a test. Anyway, what happens at the price ceiling, there's an increase in quantity demanded, but there's a slight, in the short run, decrease in quantity supplied. And remember, it takes two willing participants to a market transaction to make a market transaction. So it's always the smaller. If there's a difference between the quantity and supplied and the quantity demanded, it's always the quantity that actually gets, the smaller quantity that actually gets exchanged. So Q2 is the number of apartments rented at an effective price ceiling. And the shortage would be the difference between the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. So that would be our shortage. And generally speaking, economists are really generally opposed to price ceilings. And this model gives us a quick way to understand why. To the extent that any price ceiling is binding, notice that we've created a shortage. If we did the welfare analysis just quickly, if we assume that everybody that's willing to pay more for an apartment gets an apartment, that's not true, but it enables us to use this model to analyze efficiency or the inefficiency of a price ceiling. We see that A, B, C, D, E, we see that Area B is transferred from producers to people that get apartments at a lower cost, but there's some deadweight loss C, D, and over time that'll get worse. So that it's an inefficient policy. So that's bad. If we could think of a less inefficient or a more efficient way to address the problem of housing affordability, that would be better. The other problem with the rent control is that it's poorly targeted. What I mean by that is generally we'd like to help the poor afford housing, but if you have that's supposed to ED, if you have a shortage of apartments, and that gives landlords the ability to sift through dozens or hundreds of applications for each vacant apartment, and landlords tend to prefer wealthier people that can pay. So the poorer people are the least likely to get housing, and thus the least likely to get housing at a lower price. So it's the rent control tends to be inefficient and poorly targeted. So economists are sometimes interpreted as being opposed to measures to help the poor, and when we oppose things like price ceilings, and it's not true. That economists recognize, as do we all, that we value more equitable outcomes in society, all else equal. We value more equitable outcomes than less equitable outcomes. So the question is, if we want to help the poor, how should we do it? And economists, our answer is, well, price ceilings are really a bad way to do it. City administrations like them because you don't have to tax anybody. You just set the price ceiling and let the landlords deal with it. But economists note the inefficiency and also note that there's a lot of better ways to help the poor. One way to help the poor would be to give them money. That's sort of the far left and the far right agree that Milton Friedman proposed a negative income tax. Now you see Andrew Yang running for president on the universal basic income platform, which is actually a variant of the negative income tax idea. Anyway, one way is to give them money, but the government, because they worry that poor people are going to spend the money on drugs, whatever, there's sort of a paternalistic view of government that they tend to give money as a subsidy for buying an apartment. Section 8 housing is the federal program. And that's a much better way to help poor people afford housing, is to actually give them money, let the market clear where it may, but find, identify your poorer citizens and actually give them money to put toward housing. That requires taxing people and funding the subsidy, but it's much more efficient, much less inefficient, and much better targeted and a better way to help the poor. Other ways cities do it is inclusionary zoning. Oftentimes cities will let a developer build maybe at a higher density if the developer offers 25% of the units as affordable housing. Some of the newer price ceilings where there are limits on the percent increase, they're going to create some inefficiency, but not as bad as the traditional ones that are more rigid. And we are willing to pay for some efficiency, pay for an increase in equity with some inefficiency, but if we can get a bigger increase in equity for a smaller efficiency loss, well, that would be a much better policy. And finally, when you look at the really unaffordable cities, they tend to be cities where the planning offices, the city authorities that say yes or no to proposed projects, we see in Portland, San Francisco, Seattle, we see really, really tight restrictions on where developers can build, what they can build, how many units they can build. And a lot of people want to solve affordable housing, but they say they do, but then when a dense apartment building gets proposed in their neighborhood, well, and say, well, somebody else should have the apartment housing that would be affordable, not us. And everybody thinks like that, and as a result, you get a lot of planning boards that are very, very hostile even to developers. And one way to make housing more affordable is to build or let developers build a lot of apartments. Maybe designate a whole 16 square block area around a transit stop, and to say, hey, we're going to build a bunch of high-rise, mixed-use, inclusionarily zoned, mix of high-income and low-income people living here, and just flood the market with housing. That would drive the price down. Anyway, there's a lot of ways to help poor people afford housing. Or if you flood the market with housing, that'll help poor and rich, both. There's a lot of ways to do it better than price ceilings. That's the lesson. Not we want to help the poor. It's a good goal to help the poor, but how you help the poor matters. And getting a lot of benefit to the poor at with an efficient policy, an inexpensive policy, I guess I should say. That's a better way to help the poor.